I'm partially Norwegian. I can say with a certain fraternal affection that Mike Carney is one of them crazy Finns. Mike was born in Virginia, Minnesota, and has bachelor's and doctor's degrees from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in education from the University of Maine. He's taught at a number of places, including the University of Minnesota and Turku University in Finland. He's held a number of other positions, the Immigration History Society and so on, and is currently the president of Carney Associates, which is a consulting firm. He is the author or editor of numerous publications, including notably, and I'm going to give a try at this pronunciation, and then I'm going to ask him the first thing that he does when he gets up to give the real pronunciation, Yetishevia, or For the Common Good, Finnish Political Radicalism in the Western Great Lakes region, 1900 to 1940, and the very significant work which he co-edited, The Finnish Experience in the Western Great Lakes region, New Perspectives, in which he contributed an article which I think is very important on the split in the largest consumers cooperative in the country in 1929 and 1930. He also has done an article on saunas, but that's something else again. Mike is going to speak on pre-war agrarian socialism and radicalism. Now, we are all grateful to Marilyn Fedelchek for providing, as far as possible, a mixture of scholars and activists in these sessions. As was mentioned before, the previous session, unfortunately, could not come up with a surviving populist. But we, on this session, are most fortunate in having a long-time agrarian activist. Clarence Sharp was born on a South Dakota wheat farm in 1891, and he worked on that farm until 1911. After a time in the draying business, he went back to farming on his own in 1916, but like so many, he went broke in the great price collapse of the early 1920s. Unlike our mutual friend Otto Anstrom, when he went broke in North Dakota, he decided to go to the Soviet Union and teach the people there how to drive tractors. Mr. Sharp went to work for that fascinating man, Arthur C. Townley, in the successor organization to the Non-Partisan League, the Producers Alliance. I think it's really tremendous for us to have with us here today a man who was personally and intimately acquainted with Arthur C. Townley and people like A.W. Ricker and Bill Thatcher and a number of the leading figures of those days. Now, after a time in the implement business, Mr. Sharp went into full-time agrarian organization. I know from my own work his effectiveness during the days of the Great Depression with the Farmers National Committee for Action and the United Farmers League, which were the farm organizations of the Communist Party. Mr. Sharp spent about 20 years as the agricultural representative of the Communist Party in the state of Minnesota. He's been retired now for almost 20 years, but he continues to write for newspapers. Mr. Sharp will deal with the Socialist Party's role during the period of World War I. Scott Ellsworth is originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He graduated from Reed College, and what was his bachelor's thesis at Reed College, a study of the race riots in Tulsa in 1921, is going to be published as a book by Louisiana State University Press. He is a doctoral candidate at Duke University working under the direction of Lawrence Goodwin, who was on the previous panel. And he's affiliated with the Duke Oral History Program. He is writing in the short run an article on agrarian insurgency for the Nation magazine, and in the long run, his dissertation, which we in the know expect to be a major reinterpretation of the Nonpartisan League. Now, Scott is going to talk on the rise of the Nonpartisan League. He told me last night he had so much material that he expected to cut off at about the year 1907, and since the League was formed in 1915, that presents some problems. We'll see how he works it out. I've left my old friend Larry Remley till the last. Since 1973, Larry has been editor of what many of us think is the best and liveliest state historical journal in the country, North Dakota History. If you haven't looked at it, you should. It's damn good. He has written numerous perceptive articles on the Nonpartisan League. In fact, the last issue of North Dakota History has a very interesting piece on the beginnings of the League. He's written not only on the League, but also on the Farmers Union, the Farm Holiday Association, and he was one of the two historical consultants on that interesting film, Northern Lights. He has the Nonpartisan League in his blood, he tells me. His grandfather was an NPL commissioner in Grant County and was still writing Bill Langer's name on the ballot for years after the senator had died. Larry is working in his so-called spare time on a biography of that strange and wonderful man, Arthur C. Townley. He will speak on the decline of the Nonpartisan League. Once again, remember, this is a people's convocation, and we want your participation. So, without any further ado, we'll begin with Mike Carney. Mike?
Thank you, Lowell. I feel,
speak straight
yes, I feel slightly like an outsider today. I'm not accustomed to speaking to so many people who understand the English language. Most of the conferences I attend are ethnic, where the historians or speakers and audience alike speak with one of many European accents. And it's good to understand everything that I hear so easily. But first let me pronounce the word that Lowell mispronounced. The word is yhteishuvä, and it simply means for the common good. What did you say it was? My talk today will be very brief and very informal for several reasons, the most important being that I only learned last night what I was to speak about. But I'd like to keep it informal, and I will gladly answer any questions that you have, and I will elaborate on anything that you'd like to hear about after all of us have spoken. I'm going to speak about the Finns in the United States, in the upper Midwest, and their involvement in radical politics from approximately the turn of the century to the Russian Revolution. This is only one small portion of the story that I could tell, and the story that I am probably more, should I say, prepared to tell. Most of my research has concerned the cooperative movement in the three-state region, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the radical fight within it in 1930 and such. And I have done a little research on the earlier period of Finnish and other ethnic groups' radicalism, but I certainly don't claim to be any authority on it. But let me simply begin by saying that 350,000 Finns came to America between 1864 and 1920, or when immigration was cut off. And most of them settled within 100 miles of Lake Superior on either the north side or the south side. There are many plausible and many implausible explanations for this, but I don't think it had anything to do with the fact that the region looked like Finland, but it had something to do with the fact that work was available there, especially first in northern Michigan in the copper and iron mines, and then later in Minnesota and on the Great Mesabi Range and the Vermilion Range and the Cuyuna Range. These 350,000 Finns came to the United States with the hope eventually of returning to the farms that they had left in Finland. And they regarded their industrial experience, primarily mining experience, as simply a stop in the road to that farm. In 1906, however, when the conditions were very difficult on the Mesabi Iron Range, many Finnish radicals who had recently gone into exile from Finland after the 1905 revolution, remember that Finland at this time was a Grand Duchy of Russia, and many of the leftists in Finland had gone into exile. They had come to places such as Hibbing, Minnesota, Marquette, Michigan, Duluth, and they had begun there or had brought the word with them. And so in 1906, they were able to form what was called the Suomalainen Sosialistijärjestö, or the Finnish Socialist Federation. And in 1907, they started and led the first strike on the Mesabi Iron Range. They were in the strike with the Western Federation of Miners, and as anybody could have told then and now, it was doomed to failure. The strike lasted the most of the summer. There was violence and a great deal of harassment of strikers and such, but I'm not here to describe what happened in the strike. Simply to say that after the strike, the United States Steel Corporation blacklisted Finnish laborers in the mines in northern Minnesota, forcing many to move to the countryside. And I don't remember specifically the number of Finns who were just denied re-employment with U.S. Steel, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,500 people. And these Finns then moved to the countryside within a day's or 2 days' journey of the Mesabi Range. They had no money to return to Finland, no money to move to another part of the country, so they simply went out and took homestead property, or bought property if they could afford it, property that had already been cut over and was nearly worthless. I mean, the timber had been cut off, and it was there that they continued their socialism, creating in Minnesota and Michigan later a brand of socialism that was rural in nature. It was partly urban. There were still miners working and such, but it was basically a rural socialism. But just to give you an idea of how the hinterlands filled up, let me point out to one particular township just north of the Iron Range city of Virginia, Minnesota, about 20 miles north. In 1900, it had a population of 0. In 1905, it had a population of 24. And in 1910, it had a population of 482. And of this, included in this 482 were 77 Finnish farm families, and there were a total of 82 families altogether. So it was clearly a case of the Finns being forced out into the hinterlands. The Finnish Socialist Federation, which I mentioned earlier, was growing rapidly. By 1912, it had 17,000 members and 250 locals, and about 40% of these locals were in the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, in the mining regions. Another great agency that the Finns formed was called Työväenopisto, or Work People's College, formed in Duluth, Minnesota in 1904 or 1905, I'm not certain of the date. It ultimately became, or first it became a socialist workers' institute, which by 1912 had a 3-building campus and had approximately 260 students attending. And the only requirement for attendance was that one must have labored for his class. I mean, after that, everybody was welcome. The school taught courses in Marxist history and economics, but also simultaneously courses in bookkeeping and typing, and then the third category was agitation tactics. In 1913 and 1914, the Finns, because of their socialism, came under severe fire by official America for their role in another strike, the 6-month strike on the Keweenaw copper range in northern Michigan. And I personally think that this is one of the most brutal strikes. It's one of the longest strikes, and probably well, I won't go into what it is, but it receives so little attention from scholars that I think it deserves much more. But anyway, it was a strike against the copper interest. It wasn't started by the Finns, but the Finns were the largest ethnic group in northern Michigan, and they took part in it wholeheartedly. And one horrible result of the strike was a tragedy which occurred on Christmas Eve 1913, when about 70 Finnish children were killed in a panic in a dance hall where the strikers' children had gathered. Somebody, it is claimed, yelled fire, and there was a panic, and the doors opened inward instead of outward, and everybody piled up, and 70 children were killed. Well, after the Michigan copper strike, most of the Finnish radicals in the Midwest switched their allegiance from the socialists to the IWW. I don't know the reasons for this, but one of them obviously was that since so few of them were citizens and so few of them could vote, that it didn't it didn't really matter that much that they should join an agency which didn't believe in the vote. But anyway, the Work People's College switched. It became run by the IWW, and ultimately in the 20s and 30s it became more of an American agency, and it had many people from the IWW. But in 1916 then, the Finns in northern Minnesota again were in the forefront of a giant strike on the Mesabi Range, and many of them, of course, were still working in the mines and had definite grievances. But at this time, nearly 65% of the Finns in Minnesota lived on farms. During World War I, the Finns came under the scrutiny of a very well-known agency in Minnesota, the Minnesota Public Safety Commission, which was formed, I believe, in the legislature and served as an agency which watched disloyalty in Minnesota during World War I. They were primarily interested in the Germans in cities such as New Ulm and St. Cloud, but they also came down rather hard on Finnish IWW members in the Northeast. And at this time, a good number of the Finnish radicals in Minnesota simply moved across the Canadian border into Canada, where they went to work and where the Canadian government, who knew of their presence, did nothing because of a manpower shortage. But later, after the war, in the so-called trial of the Chicago 166, Finnish members were well represented. There were 5 prominent Finnish IWW members. involved, and they all skipped bail, and they all went either back to Finland or to Russia. At this point, I think that I had better stop, because I'll be getting into an area that I know a lot more about and will probably bore you to death with what I have to say. But I'd be happy to answer any questions now or later, and I see my role here as simply trying to suggest that an ethnic group, in this case the Finns, had a role in the agrarian radicalism of the early part of this century. Thank you.
Let's leave it there. Thank you, Mike. I think we'll leave the questions till after everyone is through. Mr. Sharp? Do your best to speak into it. They say a lot of the older people are having trouble hearing.
Fellow citizens, as Lowell indicated, I had some difficulty in cutting my talk down to 15 minutes, and therefore probably some of it won't be easily understood. I should like, first of all, to give some quotes from Eugene Debs' authorized biographer, David Carstner, which gives you some, I think, new or some ideas about this early socialist period that is somewhat surprising. In 1908, the Socialist Party ran a train called the Red Special across the country, stopped at Muscatine, Iowa, for instance, and there was met by 2,000 people. Debs, who had been speaking in other states, was on the train, and on August the 24th, he wrote as follows about his trip. He said, "Ye gods, but these are pregnant days. The hosts pour in from all directions, men, women, and children, and babies, and all of them, including the babies, are up in arms against the capitalist system. The farmers out here, thousands of them, are revolutionary to the core and ripe and ready for action. Socialists are nearly as thick out here and quite as strictly strenuous as the grasshoppers used to be. The plutes will need the doctor and the preacher when the votes are counted. The Red Special is trumped. The people are wild about it, and the road will be lined with the cheering hosts of the proletarian revolution." Then on the character of the talks that Debs was making. Here was one of them that he made in the Hippodrome in New York City. Part of his speech. He says, "Capitalism has fulfilled its mission, for the capitalist class can no longer control the productive forces, nor manage the industry, nor give employment to the workers. And so the historic mission of this movement is to abolish capitalism, based upon private ownership, and to reorganize society upon the basis of collective ownership of the means of production and distribution. This change is coming, just as certain as I stand here in your presence. It will come as soon as you are ready for it, and you will be ready for it just as soon as you understand what socialism means." Then already at this time, the danger of war began to loom on the horizon, and Debs in his speeches made an explanation of what wars were about. He said, "War does not come by chance. War is not the result of accident. There is a definite cause of war, especially a modern war. The war that began in Europe can readily be accounted for. For the last 40 years under this international capitalist system, This exploiting system, these various nations of Europe had been preparing for the inevitable. And why? In all these nations, the great industries are owned by the relatively small class. They are operated for the profit of that class. And great abundance is produced by the workers, but their wages will only buy back a small part of their product. What is the result? They have a vast surplus on hand. They have got to export it. They have got to find a foreign market for it. As a result of this, these nations are pitted against each other. They are industrial rivals, competitors. They begin to arm themselves to maintain the market and quickly dispose of their surplus. There's but one market. All these nations are competitors for it, and sooner or later, every war of trade becomes a war of blood. What was the estimate of Woodrow Wilson regarding this period in history? Don't forget, when Woodrow Wilson wrote this in 1913, after he was already the President of the United States. He cites this. He said, not many months ago, I stopped at a little town in Nebraska, and while I lingered, I met on the platform a very engaging young fellow dressed in overalls who introduced himself as the mayor of the town, added that he was a socialist. What does this mean? Does this mean this town is socialistic? No, sir, he said, I have not deceived myself. The vote by which I was elected was about 20% socialistic and 80% protest. On page 31 of this New Freedom of Woodrow Wilson's, he says, why are we in the presence? Why are we on the threshold of a revolution? Because we are profoundly disturbed by the influences which we see reigning in the determination of our public life and our public policy. There was a time when America was blithe with self-confidence. She boasted that she and she alone knew the process of popular government. But now she sees her sky overcast. She sees that they are at work forces which she did not dream of in her hopeful youth. Then again, he said on page 32, we stand in the presence of revolution, not a bloody revolution. America is not given to the spilling of blood, but a silent revolution where America will insist upon recovering in practice those ideas which she has always professed. And then again on page 33, he says, good temper, the wisdom that comes from sober counsel, the energy of thoughtful and unselfish men, the habit of cooperation and compromise has been bred into us by long years of free government, of which reason, rather than passion, has been made to prevail, and by the sheer virtue of candid and universal debate will enable us to win through to still another great age without violence. This from Woodrow Wilson. Again, he says, I am therefore forced to be a progressive, if for no other reason because we have not kept up with our changes of conditions, either in the economic field or in the political field. We have not kept up as well as other nations have. Again, on page 105, he says this, if I take my stand absolutely, where every progressive ought to take its stand on the proposition that private monopoly is indefensible and intolerable. And there I will fight my battle. And then again on page 122, he says this, if the government is to tell big business men how to run their business, then don't you see that big business have got to get closer to the government, even than they are now? Don't you see that they must capture the government in order not to be restrained too much by it? They have already captured it. They've already captured it. Are you going to invite those inside to stay inside? They don't have to get there. They are there. This is a great admission on the part of Wilson. But what was this great progressive? Was this the real Woodrow Wilson that is painted in our history books, that fooled so many people in 1916? In our state of South Dakota, we had a senator elected in 1889, when South Dakota first became a state, who wrote 3 books, very significant books. One of them was The Course of Empire. One of them was Imperial Washington. One of them was Triumphant Plutocracy. Pettigrew, who knew 10 different presidents and consistently fought against the robbery of the plunders of the trusts, among other things, was asked by Woodrow Wilson to become the manager of his campaign in 1912. So in 1911, Pettigrew was invited to Wilson's home when he was governor of New Jersey, and at that time, asking Pettigrew to take charge of his campaign, Pettigrew told his secretary that he wanted his speeches in the past, he wanted his record of vetoes and so forth. And after he had studied these, then he would let him know within 30 days what his answer would be. At the end of 30 days, he wrote this: I promptly replied that I had read all the governor's recent speeches and his veto messages and most of his works. And after carefully considering the same, I was of the opinion that he was the worst Tory in the United States, and that he used camouflage to conceal his settled opinion, and that I would not support him for the office of president, even if no one else was a candidate. Then again, he quotes extensively from Wilson's speeches. I can't quote them all in the short time I have, but I want to quote a few of them. He says, there is the country as it moves forward to its progress needs and will tolerate no party of discontent or radical experiment, but it does need a party of conservative reform acting in the spirit of ancient institutions. Then Pettigrew says, this is Woodrow Wilson's whole political creed. His position with regard to labor is well expressed in his Baccalaureate address of June 13, 1909. You know what the usual standard of the employee is in our day. It is to give as little as he may for his wages. In some trades and handicrafts, no one is suffered to do more than the least skillful of his fellows can do within the hours allotted to a day's labor. It is so unprofitable that in some trades it will presently not be worthwhile to attempt at all. He had better stop altogether than to operate at an invariable loss. The labor of America is rapidly becoming unprofitable under its present regulation by those who have determined to reduce it to a minimum. Our economic supremacy may be lost because the country grows more and more full of unprofitable servants. Again, he quotes further from Wilson's position on labor, equating the labor unions with the monopolies as a greater danger even than the monopolies, although he claimed to be against the monopolies. Pettigrew again says, he is bitterly and sneeringly opposed to every man who toils and to every progressive principle. He knows little or nothing about the purposes of socialism. And again, another to show his duplicity, here's a quote from his speech that he made on the 26th of February 1917 less than 60 days before America entered World War I. In that speech, he said, "I am not now proposing or contemplating war and any step that may lead to it." The President made this declaration 11 days after the Advisory Council of Big Business appointed by him had in its secret session, as now disclosed by an examination of the records of the meetings, discussed the exclusion of labor from the military service, discussed the draft law months before it was intimated to Congress or the country that we were to raise an army to draft to fight for a foreign war. So much for the position of Woodrow Wilson. 3 minutes. But despite his mastery of demagoguery, and for instance, in the campaign of 1916 in North Dakota, where the Nonpartisan League captured all the offices in the Republican primary, Woodrow Wilson carried the state of North Dakota on the Democratic Party. But despite his mastery of demagoguery, and his masters did not rely upon demagoguery alone. Even before 1917, when the country was involved even before, in 1916, when the country was involved with the war in Mexico, he had a militia organization which broke up meetings of socialists, and when he was involved in the Second World War, or the First World War, he had the Espionage Act, under which many more than 100 leaders of the Socialist Party were sent to prison for 10 years for having made statements that would be interpreted as discouraging the draft. One example of his own personal participation in the persecution of people who opposed the war was the case of Rose Pastor Stokes, one of the leading, a rich woman, by the way, who was a leading speaker for the Socialist Party and later for the Nonpartisan League. And she made a statement to the press in which she said she did not support the war because the war was for the profiteers and she was for the people, and therefore she couldn't support the war. And because of this, she was dragged into court, sentenced to 10 years in prison. And when this happened, Creel pointed out that in one of the papers that there was a call for prosecuting the editor, Ralph Stout of the Kansas City Star, who printed this letter. And the president wrote directly to the Attorney General of Kansas and demanded that he bring charges against the owner of the Kansas City Star. So I just want to close with this point. As I see it, we are at that point in history where we have to raise the question, in the light of the Carter Doctrine at the present moment of history, in which he claims interests all over the world, we need to raise the question, whether are we not at that point of history wherein the ownership of all the means of production and distribution, the ownership of the government itself by the big monopolies, if this doesn't present us with a situation in which we have to ask, is it possible for the American people to survive in these conditions with this ownership in the hands of these big monopolies? I would say that one of our best hopes of winning this battle, which we lost in 1917, and which resulted in 10 million dead in the First World War, 50 million dead in the Second World War, millions more destroyed. Now we're confronted with a new crisis. And here I would like to quote one little word from President Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, in which he says, to the doctrine of military hysteria and frenzied arms race, we oppose the doctrine of consistent struggle for peace and security on earth. And in my opinion, the only thing that will save us now is the united action of the great masses of the American people and the people of the world against the Carter Doctrine, and only this will save us.
Thank you, Clarence. I think you did a magnificent job of boiling 45 minutes down into 15. Now we'll see if Scott Ellsworth can get beyond 1907.
Hi. I'd like to speak for about 15 minutes or so on the social and political origins of the Non-Partisan League. If the populist movement in America was the last democratic, mass-based movement prior to the implementation of a corporate state in this country, then the Non-Partisan League was the first democratic movement of our age. In fact, there are many similarities between North Dakota in 1915 and the United States in 1980. Most of the people out there vote for Republican and Democratic parties every 2 years, every 4 years. A few crazies might vote for something else. But somehow things don't seem to change. The rich remain rich and the poor remain poor. The Non-Partisan League was founded in 1915 in North Dakota, and although the primary focus today will be in North Dakota, it should be pointed out that the League was in 17 states during its career, and it claimed a peak membership upward of 200,000 people, primarily wheat farmers. This is the question. How did the people of North Dakota come to support the Non-Partisan League? How, after voting all their lives for the corporate political parties, did they come to vote for the League, which in effect has been the most successful socialist movement in our history? How did these people become radicalized? Some have suggested hard times were the reason. It's because of hard times that you had a revolt. But times are always hard for poor people, and more than that, many of the Western farmers who did not vote for the League suffered under the same economic constraints as those who did. Rather, the people who joined the Non-Partisan League in North Dakota did so because they had collectively shared some experiences in the cooperative struggle in that state during the first decade and a half of the 20th century. Now, cooperatives were not new to North Dakota in 1900. But they vastly grew during the next 15 years. The most common form of cooperative institution was a local grain elevator. There were 4 of these in 1900 in the state, 41 in 1905, 200 in 1910, and over 400 in 1915. Some of these were founded by local farmers acting on their own. Many others were formed by a farm organization known as the American Society of Equity, and all or virtually all of the grain elevators and local co-ops became associated with the Equity. Now, the Equity was founded in Indiana in 1903 as a non-political farm organization. It came to North Dakota 4 years later, and it first tried to conduct wheat holding campaigns amongst the farmers, which were not very successful. The big grain companies and the terminal grain markets were aware of what was going on, and they would just wait out any wheat holding in an attempt to keep the prices low. So the movement there, the leadership of the movement was faced with a movement that might die unless they came up with something else. And what they came up with was to support the cooperative movement, and they did this in 3 ways. One was by supporting and establishing local cooperative institutions such as elevators and cooperative stores. Secondly, they did it by supporting the movement for a state-owned terminal grain elevator for North Dakota, which had long been a dream which had roots back to the populist period. And thirdly, by trying to establish their own terminal marketing facilities in the Twin Cities, namely the Equity Cooperative Exchange, as a way to cooperatively market the farmers' wheat and save them much of the money they lost when the grain was sold through the commercial exchanges. Now, by supporting the local co-ops, the Equity recruited and organized the farmers of North Dakota. Local cooperators were organized into local chapters. They read the equity newspaper. They listened to equity speakers. They attended equity conventions. And in effect, for the first time in the history of most of those people, they began to communicate with each other, and barriers were broken down. Farmers in one county would come to realize that the problems they faced with bankers, with the commercial grain elevators, with the railroads, were also shared by their brethren who lived over 300 miles away. The shared experiences of the farmers and the equity served to educate them, and the equity broke down these barriers. Now, over time, the farmers became politically radicalized through the equity experience. Now, this came through what happened to the equity leadership in their campaign for setting up a farmers' terminal grain agency, selling agency, the Equity Cooperative Exchange. Now, the idea of the exchange was simply for the farmers to sell their grain cooperatively and thus to increase their returns on the sale of their wheat. Now, as you can imagine, the exchange was bitterly opposed by the two main commercial grain exchanges at that time, the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce and the Chicago Board of Trade. But over time, what became evident that amongst the most bitter members of this attempt for a farmers' cooperative exchange were the actual elected officials of the states. In Minnesota, right-wing members of the legislature backed by the Chamber of Commerce started an investigation of the Equity Cooperative Exchange, claiming that their leaders were frauds. There was a great slander campaign that was run by the Chamber of Commerce and the Board of Trade against the Farmers Exchange. And ultimately, in the investigations of the equity, the North Dakota State Attorney General joined in. Now, this led to a growing movement for independent political action amongst the leadership and membership of the equity. And it was further fueled by an incident in Fargo, North Dakota in 1914 at what was called the Triannual Grain Growers Convention, in which they had about 3 days of, it was a conference, 3 days of speeches about how to grow grain better and how to market it better, whatnot. And they had an equity day there one day. And but the equity speakers were cut off short, and they were forcibly pulled down off the platform by the mayor of Fargo and the city police force. And it was incidents like this that tended to stoke the fires for independent political movement within the equity society itself. Now, what happened to the leaders also filtered down to the equity members who had been previously organized. And all that was really needed after that was to have a nonpartisan league were two events: someone to establish it, and also a catalytic event to help get it off to a good start. Now, the people who founded the Nonpartisan League did not come out of the equity. They came out of the North Dakota Socialist Party. Now, the party during the first 15 years of the state's history was traditionally oriented in the sense of a fairly doctrinaire Marxist approach to societal change. They saw the urban working class as being the hope for the society, and consequently, the Socialist Party didn't do very well in North Dakota during the first 15 years. It was probably possible for one member of the party to know every single member of the urban proletariat in North Dakota. There are also problems with the fact that many people in the party and the party leadership supported the collectivization of land, which didn't go over too big. And so in 1914, there was within the party a group of reformers who wanted the party to amount to more than it had so far, and they established something called the organization department of the party. And they did not stress the collectivization of land. They stressed a farmers program of state-owned institutions such as a terminal elevator and state-owned flour mill. Now, they also soft-sell, the organizers of the organization department also soft-sell the word socialism, and one was joining the organization department and not the Socialist Party. Well, lo and behold, the organization department organizers were quite successful. and a lot of people started to join what in effect was joining the party. Well, the doctrinaire members within the party leadership became very worried about this, and they felt that this sort of watered-down version of socialism was going to take over the party. And the only reason they really allowed the organization department to get started was that they were that their newspaper was very much in debt, and they thought that might add some new revenue. Well, so what the doctrinaire socialists did was to kill the organization department and say it was simply too reformist, and that it was going to mess up the revolution rather than help to foment it. So after that happened, those people who had organized the department quit the party. And so you're left with a small cadre of highly political, highly trained organizers who started to discover they had some success with their movement if they soft-sold the word socialism. And they, in effect, organized the League. Now, the catalytic event through which the League occurred happened in the January session of the 1915 North Dakota legislature. There had been a movement within the state, concurrent to all these other things, for a state-owned terminal grain elevator. And North Dakota laws were written as such that the Constitution had to be amended by 2 successive legislatures and then approved by the people before you could have the bill, so it was about a 6 or 8 year process. Now, in 1913, the bill had finally been approved, and the legislature set up a committee to study for the next 2 years what would be the best way to build this state-owned terminal elevator. Well, the committee, during the course of its 2 years, spoke to such impartial consultants as many of the members of the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, of the Chicago Board of Trade, and James J. Hill. And so in 1915, at the legislature, they reported back that after all, the terminal elevator was a bad idea and we shouldn't have one. And the legislature ended up not appropriating any money for it. Now, concurrent with the legislature meeting, there was a convention of the Equity Society in Bismarck for North Dakota, and the equity representatives there were understandably a little bit angered at this, and there followed some verbal violence between members of the equity and members of the state legislature, in which one state legislator is rumored to have told the farmers to go home and slop the hogs, and that lawmaking was their business. Well, during all of that heyday in Bismarck, during the convention and during the state legislature, the organization department socialists were there, but they were no longer in the organization department. They were in a group called the Farmers Non-Political Non-Partisan League. And they began their organizing at that convention. And the key to getting the League off the ground were the alliances that were formed between those people who had been in the party, who had been in the organization department, and those independents within the equity movement. And that's essentially how the League got going. Just one other comment, I guess, would be in part because we're going to see Northern Whites tonight and have seen it, or some of you may have seen it already. Unfortunately, the way that organizing was portrayed in Northern Lights, there are some inaccuracies to that. What the original Nonpartisan League propagandists gave as how the state was organized has been picked up by most historians. And what their version was that an organizer driving out in a Model T Ford with a blank of membership receipts would go into a community unknown to him and find a local prominent farmer and convince that person that they were going to that the League was serious business, and that they would go out, and the prominent farmer, who they called a booster, would introduce the organizer to another farmer, and they would get people in that way. Well, it didn't exactly happen that way. The mass base of the Nonpartisan League had been already organized and radicalized by the equity. The people who joined the Nonpartisan League in 1915 were equity members. Much of the organization of the League took place at actual equity meetings at the local chapters when they would have a meeting on Saturday. Now, some of the field organizing happened, but the booster was not simply a prominent member of the community. The booster was one of the equity leaders in the local area, and he would take that person and introduce the organizer to the various other local members of the society. Larry, you want to take it from here? Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is that they won. The bad news is that they lost. When the League took power in 1915, they had one goal in mind, and that was to build a one-state political movement that would act in the interests of the majority of the citizens of that particular state. And in North Dakota in 1915, that was by far the farming communities of the state, the farming people. The League started in February with 3 members. Within 7 months, it collected 18,000 members. A significant gain. There was, in other words, the equity had laid the groundwork aptly, and the movement's seeds fell on fertile soil. Now, there are a number of reasons why the League took power so quickly, or gained itself enough support to take power so quickly. First of all, as Scott has pointed out very aptly, it began with strong leadership of experienced veterans of the radical and cooperative movements. These people knew precisely what they wanted. The League benefited from the equity connection and the support of North Dakota's other farm cooperative organizations, especially the Farmers Union. The League benefited from the leadership of Arthur C. Townley. And this leadership guided the organizing process very judiciously. Contrary to the myth, to the popular myth primarily fomented in Moreland's Political Prairie Fire, which is the most widely read history of the Non-Partisan League, League organizing was not a secret in North Dakota in 1915. The League itself fomented limited publicity in favorable newspapers. One article published in early June or late May claimed 6,000 members, and this was fairly widely distributed. The League moved its headquarters as the organizing progressed from the northwestern corner of the state to the southeastern corner of the state, each time stopping in a regional market center, a city. It's pretty hard to stay secret when you're living in a city. The third thing, the League wanted publicity, and it wanted a means of attempting to unite the members together, to bring the members together and to keep them informed. Therefore, the League consciously sought a means of starting a newspaper, and in September of 1915, they began with the nonpartisan leader. And finally, the process of taking power included the mass rallies and the development of a political culture, as Dr. Goodwin has pointed out so strongly in regard to the populace. The Nonpartisan League's first mass meeting, occurred in a little town called Pettibone, North Dakota in December 1915, on December 7th. And it was not announced beforehand in the League media, for the specific reason that the League organizers and leaders themselves were not sure of the response of the farmers. As a result, Townley and his people came into Pettibone, which is a little tiny town in the central part of the state, got off the train, went to the hall, noticed that the streets seemed to be unusually filled with buggies and rigs and cars and that sort of thing, but there was nobody in the hall. They walked in, they sat down, Townley got up and started talking to the 4 organizers who were sitting in front of him, and within half an hour the place was jammed. People started looking in the door and then walking in. At the end of the meeting, farmers reported having driven 35 and 40 miles across the prairies to attend. The word of mouth had spread the word that fast. North Dakota was ripe for the Nonpartisan League in 1915. Well, once they got organized or had a significant amount of state organizing done, their next step was to campaign and to attempt to take power within the state. In order to do this, the Nonpartisan League used every possible unifying factor that they could. They used symbolism. The first caucuses were held on February 22nd, which is not only Washington's birthday, but it was the traditional meeting day for the Populist Party, or populist activists and populist locals. The League attempted to create a real dichotomous feeling among the people, us versus them, us versus the old gang. The League used propaganda in an extensive manner, leaflets, newspapers, cartoons, the effective cartoons of John Baer, who became the League's first congressman. In his cartoons, Baer always portrayed the opposition in a graphic sense. You could always tell who the enemy was. They were bloated, had diamond rings on their fingers, wore bowler hats. They were city folks, if you want to put it that way. And not just city folks, they were Minneapolis folks. The farmer, on the other hand, looked very much like Uncle Sam in his coveralls and with the hayseed hanging out of his hair. Symbolism. Unite the people, get the people to identify with the movement you're trying to foment. And finally, the League made a conscious decision in 1916 to work through the primary election system and to work primarily within that system through the majority party in North Dakota, which was the Republican Party. Now, how do you choose candidates and get them together? Well, the League called its caucuses in February. These caucuses selected representatives to district conventions. The district conventions selected representatives to the state convention, held in Fargo in late March and early April. They wanted the best people, and they told their local caucuses that that is what they wanted. Throw out the obvious office seeker. Take the one who does not seek the office. They used an open nominating process, in other words. When they got to the state convention, the 49 district delegates sat down and tried to put together a state ticket that could win. To put this ticket together, the leadership and the delegates to that convention agreed that what they wanted to do was build a coalition, a winning coalition, not just of people who had farm concerns, but also to bring in the other concerns, the prohibitionists, the women's suffrage people, these other movements that had some support, progressive support within the state. The candidates that were selected by this particular district, the first state convention, reflected this kind of coalition building. For example, the man they chose for governor was a Pembina County farmer named Lynn Frazier. Now, most histories of the League say that Frazier was an unknown and play up the fact that some newspaper in North Dakota, after the convention had been held, said, "Who in hell is Frazier and where in hell is Hoople?" which was his hometown. The fact is that Lynn Frazier was well known within the equity movement. He'd been a candidate for the National Equity Governing Committee. The others on the ticket reflect pretty much the same sort of conscientious, judicious choice of candidates to build a coalition that could win. For example, the candidate for Attorney General was William Langer, well known for his strict enforcement of the prohibition laws in Morton County, North Dakota. The candidate for Superintendent of Public Instruction was Neil C. McDonald, well known among educators in North Dakota for his support of school consolidation and improved curriculums. You can go on right down the list and pick out these people who have these identified stands on issues. Okay, they got the ticket. The next step was to win the election. To do that, you build a political culture. You build it through use of symbolism. The League symbol was the goat. Why the goat? Because the goat thinks and fights with its head, according to the leader. And the phrase that went along with that was that the League was the goat that can't be got. They created the bandwagon, the large open-air picnics and rallies, used very often by the socialists and the populists. You begin with a massive rally at the nominating convention and end with the Frazier Special. We just heard about the Red Special. These are techniques that were tried and true. You put them together along with your ideology, and then you use